Kia ora tātou, nai mai, haere mai. Good morning and welcome to today's The Event with our guest of honour, Mark Peterson, Chief Executive of the NZX. Mark, welcome and thank you for your time today. I'd like to thank our series partners of our virtual events, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, IBM, Red Hat and ServiceNow. Thank you for your ongoing support. We can't do what we do without you and we truly value it. For those of you familiar with the format, you can ask and we encourage questions throughout today's event through the Q&A feature down the bottom of your screen. And joining us today is our moderator, Nio Merrick. Nio, always a pleasure to have you with us, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Mark, for being here today. Mark, the New Zealand Stock Exchange, I don't think there's ever been a time in history when there's been so much going on the stock exchange in such a short period of time. We've seen the New Zealand NZX drop by 6.47% this year. We've seen the Dow Jones take the biggest hit in a single day ever on the 16th of March at 9.9%. We've seen the Black Mondays, another Black Monday, 4 of them in a row, and the 2021 being the worst ever. We've seen the Nikkei bounce down and not come back, the NASDAQ bounce down and come back a little bit. If you can describe it as one thing, you could describe it as volatile. And we know that volatility creates both opportunity and challenges. Before I ask you all about your life at the stock exchange, I'd like to know a little bit about you personally and what the last month has been like for you, Mark. Tell us a bit about your bubble and how you're spending your time in lockdown, given that today is your first day of freedom.
Yes, level 2 today, which we're all very excited about. What's my bubble like? I have 2 teenage children and my wife, Andrea. So we've got both of the children are at home. Matthew's studying down in Otago in Dunedin, and for him actually things haven't changed too much at all. Otago actually jumped straight to online learning pretty jolly quickly, and so he was busy continuing with various assignments and tests and all that sort of stuff. Georgie, my daughter, she was flatting in Wellington. She goes to Victoria, so she came home along, and all her flatmates went home. They were a little bit slower to get online, so she had a bit of time off, which was we're all envious of. But from my point of view, as a business, we moved to sort of week at home and a week at work for the critical functions, which has meant that we've all had to set up at home. We took a while to get used to each other again back here. We all had to sort of set some ground rules and have a little bit of respect when people are busy, but it's actually worked well, to be fair, and we've all got used to it. I think though people are getting sort of a little bit tired of it all. They do want to get out and about and see their friends and just get a little bit of normality back though.
Yeah, it's been an interesting time, and I think you've hit on it, is we all had to get used to each other again. Like, we live in a house with these people, but actually don't spend that much time with them regularly, and now we've had to. And I'm feeling you also that we're done. People are ready to go back. The coffee shops this morning were lined up all the way along Rossday Bay, so people were definitely ready to get out and do some stuff. Mike, tell us about a typical day for you. What does your typical day look like now?
Well, as I said, I still do week about. So I have a week in the office. This week it's actually at home. To that end, maybe not so much a typical day, but if I talk about a typical week, we're still running our crisis management committee meetings 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays. We also have, I have regular sort of VC type calls with my senior leaders. We're trying to carry on as much as possible, and we are sort of one of the lucky industries in the sense that it is very, very busy, and to that end it has thrown up some different types of challenges. But a lot of what we're doing at the moment is just keeping the communications going. We've changed up quite a lot on me talking to the entire business, me talking to the senior leaders more often than we used to, the teams talking to each other, the teams, talking within each other, within each other's bubbles, and also cross teams. So we've had to change the way we communicate. We've been lucky we've been able to do that reasonably effectively, and actually it's one of the things that people are saying, look, we really like some of the stuff to endure, because we're probably having more comms now than on what's going on and where the direction is and what the activity looks like than ever before. So those are the sort of things that we will pick up and carry on with. But yeah, really it is focusing on the sort of the key elements that haven't changed for us. It is about customers, it is about market communications, It is about making sure that we've got the teams on the right track, but just doing that slightly differently. We've had a number of board meetings as well. You know, the board's obviously critically involved, you know, in times like this, in various committees of the board who have, you know, responsibility for different aspects of our business. You know, so we've had a lot more togetherness around this and a lot more connection.
And it's interesting that sometimes it takes a crisis to pull us all together and to improve that communication. It sounds like you're having a lot of meetings, town hall meetings every day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, crisis management meetings, board meetings. Is there enough time to still do your job, Mark?
Well, but I guess this is one of the things that, you know, comes with the territory of being at home, is that, you know, your travel time to work is zero. You know, you feel like you can almost sort of, one of the dangers really, I can hop downstairs, you know, get on and work, and you just don't realize you're continuing to work. So, you know, probably spending more time working than we've done before. You can be reasonably efficient. What we've found across the business is that the efficiency levels and the productivity levels of everybody, you know, has certainly not dropped away. In some areas, you know, some parts of our business are saying that's actually been more productive. You know, hence, again, one of the other enduring things that we'll probably take away is a little bit, we'll take a different approach to working remotely. We're not exactly sure what that looks like yet, but there's certainly been some upside that we've discovered through this, you know, compulsory experiment that we will need to pick up and carry on with.
It's a very interesting comment. Of all the interviews with the resilient leaders, that's been a sort of resounding theme that, yep, we're going to look differently at working from home. We didn't used to trust people that they would actually be productive. Now they've proved they can be. And that creates big advantages, especially for women in business who are looking for a bit of flexibility around childcare and things. So I think it's a big push forwards. It's one of the big bonuses. Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about the tech that's enabled what you're able to do? I mean, we've basically been pushed 5 years into the future technologically, and some of that's been kicking and screaming, and I heard you say that there are some challenges that have arisen that you didn't expect, and I want to explore those separately. But how has tech enabled you, and what's changed for you in that front?
Yeah, well, certainly BCP for us was a critically important aspect of the business. We are a piece of infrastructure of the economy, which is incredibly important, capital markets and exchanges at the center of it. You know, so we had some pretty strict BCP type development that had been done, the testing of all of that. We were lucky in the sense that whether it was luck or good management, you know, I'd like to claim a little bit of good management, but we'd actually been doing quite a lot of BCP testing right across the business through the back end of last year. And that was every area. So not just what we'd call the critical areas, being, you know, the market operations functions, the regulatory functions, and the, you know, some of the technology functions that support the markets, but all areas. So in that sense, you know, we'd had a very, very, you know, recent sense of how we were set up to, you know, go straight into BCP. All our business had been set up on laptops previously. One of the things that we learned when we were doing the BCP is we did actually have to create, you know, much greater capacity around our connectivity into the exchange through the VPNs for our staff. But that was all put in place already. So when the Prime Minister actually announced on that, I think it was a Tuesday, or it might have been a Monday, and then we were going to lockdown on the Wednesday. We actually had probably one of our critical teams already in BCP, so they were already at home. And to be fair, the technology that supported it, whether it's the connectivity in, the video chat, you know, the other sort of text chat, emails, you know, all of that connectivity piece came out of the box, and we'd sort of been used to it. One of the things, though, that we had to do is actually think about how we're going to run the business in that model. And, you know, going into lockdown, what we took was an approach where we said every team member has red or blue status. So we split the teams in half. And we then said, we've got a critical set of functions, which are those that absolutely run the market. And then we've got a range of businesses that fit around that. So we called them critical and non-critical. What we then did is we said, okay, for the critical teams, they come in to the office for a week, and then they work from home for a week. So they'd flip. So we'd never have, you know, the full set of critical team people in the office or mixing together. And then all those non-critical roles, they were always working from home. So that's how we ran level 4, and we could slip into that mode pretty quickly. actually. And as I said, those BCP tests before were very, very useful. What we've done, and we carried that through to alert level 3. And then what we're going to do in level 2 is we're going to lose the critical, non-critical piece, but we're still going to have the red and blue status. Again, just as a precaution, I know there's more flexibility than this, but just as a precaution, we will still run the week about, but we'll do that for everybody. So for non-critical folk, they will come back to the office for 1 week and 2. And that'll be a sort of a step towards normality. And then we'll review that over the next few weeks just to see whether we actually get everybody back into the office completely. But, you know, we're just sensing people are a little bit cautious, you know, about getting on public transport. You know, we've got some folk that, you know, have some, you know, health issues that we're going to be super careful of. We've got a few older people that we're going to be careful of. And we'll apply some discretion there for them to feel comfortable about it. And you can do that simply because we've got this connectivity that actually works. So, you know, we'll just be a little bit cautious, but certainly, you know, that model worked well. Our engagement with our customers, both issuers and brokers, you know, the brokers actually took a very, very similar model to us, particularly for their trading desks and their operational functions. You know, all their advisory folk were obviously working from home, but a lot of comms out to the brokers just to keep in sync with all of that. And then our relationship management teams were obviously very, very closely connected to the issuers. But yeah, it's actually worked well. I think we were pretty lucky in the sense that we were well planned. Our capability was all there. I did listen to a person in the lounge just before lockdown occurred where they were desperately trying to get hold of laptops, you know, with 2 days to go. I think if you're a business and you're in that, you know, that state, it would have been terribly difficult. But we were not anywhere near that. We were quite well organised.
And and thank you for that. It sounds a very pragmatic approach, but if we look at what you're actually telling us there, it's that you prepared ahead of time for something that had happened from business continuity. So when it did happen, you guys just jumped into it fairly quickly. And that, while you say it has a bit of luck, is also some very good management. Mark, we've got some questions coming in. I still have some of my own, but I'm going to jump into a couple of these. There's a couple of questions around New Zealand's place in the global market and us in Australia and whether you think or not that we are a bit of a safe haven now.
I think so. I think Australasia generally is, you know, I think in terms of the way it's dealt with the health issue, you know, first and foremost, I think that's going to stand us in very good stead. You know, I think, you know, both capital markets, you know, are pretty resilient, you know, really when you compare them to the rest of the world. And certainly from an NZX point of view, you know, and you mentioned some stats there before where, you know, we do look quite a defensive market. We've typically been quite a high yielding market. And, you know, once upon a time, you know, go back a long way, you know, we were a risk on market. So international investors would invest into New Zealand if they had the ability to take more risk. But in actual fact, we're probably seen more as a risk off market now. You know, just with the type of companies that we have, the balance sheet strength that they typically have and the yield that they were paying. And to some extent, I think Australia's in really good shape as well in that regard. When you look across the globe and the fact that the health crisis has not been probably as well managed as down under, you know, that I think is going to flow through to the economic environment, you know, quite materially, which just creates uncertainty for people. And investors would prefer to be able to look forward, you know, with a degree of certainty. And it's all relative here because, you know, certainly everything's uncertain. But I just think we look like we're in better shape than a lot of the globe at the moment.
And I think the comment that the rest of the world hasn't managed it quite as well as down under is an understatement, Mark, and you might be underplaying the fact that we've managed it incredibly well.
That's what Kiwis do, don't they? They're understated.
Yes. Bit of speculation around negative interest rates. Quick question from Andrew Bevan. And what does that look like in an environment for the NZX?
Very, very interesting question. And we have got, well, there's two layers to that. One is, you know, how does it flow through to the environment that we're operating? And then there's a whole practical aspect of you know, making sure you can actually cope with a negative interest rate. And it does affect different parts of our business, you know, certainly in terms of the collateral we hold and where that's placed in terms of the banks. And that's, you know, for our clearinghouse, you know, right through to our funds business, right through to our platforms business. So we're actually looking at all of that at the moment at a very practical level, trying to understand exactly what that means and what it means at an operational level and what it means from a financial return level and a market level. But But if you think sort of more macro in that environment, it's just such a very odd place to be, where effectively you put money into the bank and you pay for the privilege. And I think everybody's going to sort of try and figure this out sort of over the next little while, because you read from the monetary policy statement that came out yesterday from our Reserve Bank, that we need to be prepared for it, and whether it happens or not, it's another matter, but certainly we need to be ready for it.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting thing. They're struggling with some of that in the US right now, so we should be watching what they're doing quite closely too. I guess another question is NZX's role in the economy. You've said that you are a big player and that you do have a big impact. How do you see your role changing as a result of the crisis?
Yeah, fascinating actually. And if I back up a little bit from that question, I think one of the things that's coming through now is that access to capital, or the value of having access to capital, is probably being recognised more now than it's ever been. And you see the response that companies are making, to the extent that people are listed and they do have access to capital. We're seeing that across New Zealand and Australia, with the raises for the companies that are under pressure. And that's proving to be very, very valuable right now. When you look into the private company world or the smaller company world, the immediate response from central government and others is, in the banks, is to create liquidity for them, offer up more debt, which is fine, I think, for the short term. But I think we've got to be very, very careful here, because some of these businesses do have some uncertain future, and debt may not be the right sort of solution. But equity, I think, as all of this unfolds a little bit more, I think the value that people will place on having access to equity and the way that they think about their balance sheet structures in terms of debt and equity ratios, I think that's going to change. And to some extent, that can be a very, very real opportunity for the public markets. I think people have generally looked at the burden that compliance brings, if you're publicly listed, and they've sort of really struggled with that. But I think in times of crisis, where all of a sudden access to capital becomes very, very important, then running a business around a decent set of regulatory obligations is probably something that's well worth taking on if you actually got access to capital as a result.
It's not a huge surprise to hear you saying that equity is an alternative to debt, given your role, and I'd be surprised if you had another view, but thank you for that. It does lead to one of the other questions that we've had, which is, how do you find the business mood among investors now, especially with the appetite for capital raise?
Yeah, well, what we're seeing, and I don't think this is much different in Australia either, but what we're seeing is the markets are very, very supportive of companies that they believe in and that they trust. And if they're coming to them, with a request for capital, these are being, very, very well sought. So we do know those that have come already for capital raises. The book builds are heavily oversubscribed, which I think gives you a sense of how investors are feeling about this stuff. So, I think there's some enthusiasm there to support companies. And I think what it's showing is that the capital markets are there and ready, despite the uncertainty, despite the crisis, despite the economic conditions. If they believe in those businesses, they've had a good track record, they'll help them out. So I think in many senses that sends a really, really positive signal. I think the other thing, from an investor point of view is the activity we've seen around trading. And, as you said, we've seen some really, really volatile times, particularly through the back end of March and early April. That has created opportunity for trading at the institutional level. It's certainly picked up, liquidity has picked up right across both the institutional investors, the retail investors, the ETF flows, the liquidity flows, and a lot of electronic execution. So we've seen a big lift in liquidity, which, in many senses is great, simply because, certainly on the retail side, people, we've often sort of worried a little bit about, retail wanting to get back into the markets. Well, now we're seeing that when the time is right, or they see value, they see value in the market, then retail are just as savvy as anybody else.
Interesting. You've seen a big uptake in retail investors too, haven't you?
We have, yeah, we have.
And there's some new techniques and new technology for them to become involved with the stock exchange.
Yeah, well, certainly we've got our, sort of traditional advised brokers. We've got, brokers that promote a sort of a more do-it-yourself type type service with ASB Securities and Direct Broking, which is partly, which is owned by Jarden now. And then our newcomer to the market, Sharesies, which has taken a different approach. They've grown particularly strongly. They've reached a part of the market which is showing quite a lot of interest. They're making it accessible, with the way that they've adapted their product, for electronic capability. And I think at last count, they had about 150,000 clients that have joined up since they've launched. So they're growing very, very strongly, but it is across all of those areas that the activity is rising. Talking to people, that understand, the ASB Securities world and the direct broking world as well. Their applications from customers to join and the activity that is coming through, is probably at the highest levels they've ever seen as well.
And I'm a new Sharesy customer. I'm one of the 150,000. I have my $2,000 in that Sharesy account, watching it grow slowly. And as you've just said, I invested in companies I believe in, like Air New Zealand. So in a microcosm. There are some questions, Mark, on the tech sector, which is my passion as well. And what's your approach to that market, and what are its prospects for growth? But aligned with that, what about the other small advanced nations in our region, like Singapore?
Taking those one at a time. In terms of the tech sector, I think New Zealand's going to lean on, in terms of its recovery, on a couple of different areas. Tech will probably be one of them, because it is, it has got no boundaries really in terms of how you sell that to the world. And when borders are potentially going to be locked down for quite a while, we do need to be able to sort of, reach out to the rest of the globe to grow. And I think the other one's going to be agriculture. We're going to lean on that, and I think that's going to be a sector that's going to need some capital. But with respect to tech, we've got some really, really innovative businesses in New Zealand. They're growing strongly. It's an area from an exchange point of view that we really want to get close to. We do a bunch of stuff now with the TIN team and various others in terms of sponsorships and getting to know the emerging businesses there. And we're very enthusiastic about really helping these companies offer that ability to access capital when they need it. We've got some really good conversations going on.
Excellent. And I'm really pleased to hear that. I work on startups of a number of small tech companies who will be coming to visit you, Mark. What about Singapore and Israel and Denmark and Ireland and the other small advanced nations? Have we got any plans to do any work with those?
Well, we do have, what we have is memorandums of understanding with a number of different markets around the world, and it's really sort of a horses for courses approach. We've got one with the NZX, which is largely tech related. Actually, we leverage a fair bit of their technology, but it also obviously being connected to the US markets is a really good thing for a whole lot of reasons. We've got MOUs with Singapore. I think they're going to be really well positioned. I think Singapore, in Asia, as Asia emerges out of the health issue, so we felt that there was a very good place to be connected to, quite like-minded in terms of their approach to customers, the value that they want to bring, access to capital, etc. And we're seeing a few more businesses, out of New Zealand that actually want to connect up into Singapore. So that relationship is probably something that's got quite a bit in front of it. In terms of Israel and Ireland and various other areas, where they have had a focus on tech for a long time, I think they're being competed for, quite aggressively at the moment. We haven't had, I must say, a lot to do with Ireland and Israel, but we are sort of focusing more, focusing on companies that are coming out of New Zealand, and then obviously the links to the NASDAQ and the links into Singapore to help them out.
Excellent, thank you for that. I've got a couple of questions here around your magic insight into the future, your crystal ball, Mark.
Wow, okay.
One of them, I'm really quite keen on this one, is what are the biggest changes that will arise and what will never change, which is a relevant question too at the same time, with global markets, global capital markets? I
think this access to capital, I think, is going to be really, really important. It's the theme I mentioned earlier. And the value that boards and executive teams place on having access to diversified capital sources. I think gone are the days, when I think about sort of New Zealand businesses where, the default is obviously the bank at the moment, first and foremost. I think people are really going to make sure that they've got that covered. And it could be, for further equity, And if you're a private business, I think we're going to see the emergence of companies like Syndex in New Zealand, which, do perform some really good capability, both administratively and having access to capital if companies want to stay private. But then I think too, if people are of a size where they do want to grow and accessing capital to help them grow, or they do want to be more resilient, and they need access to either equity capital or debt capital, remembering our debt market is a very, very well-developed market, then I think that diversification of ability to fund your business through different mechanisms, whether it's bank, tapping equity, tapping the market for debt, through corporate type securities, I think those are going to play a much greater role. So I think they will endure. I think the other thing too is, people will be ready for this type of health issue again. You sort of, you can't but think that, this can't be the only virus that escapes from somewhere and spreads around the world. Maybe it's going to be a little harder to spread if the planes aren't flying. But certainly I think, the economy needs to be a little bit more resilient to pandemics. And, that will shape businesses a bit more. I mean, I just think about our business with respect to the things that we might do less of. And the use of technology to supplement or to substitute for travel and various other things. It won't substitute it completely. I think particularly if you're wanting to build relationships with potential new customers or new investors or whatever, I think there is going to be a need to continue to meet face to face for that stuff. But for folk that you've actually got an existing relationship with, which is strong, and we had a live example of this when we did our annual results roadshow. We knew who we were talking to. We'd met and worked up strong relationships over the past few years with them. VC was absolutely fine. We didn't need to jump on a plane, and take a week or whatever it is out of your day, or a week out of your the time of the office. To go and do that. You can be very, very efficient, meet for an hour, do it on BC, avoid the airfare, keep the cost down, and that worked for everybody. So I think those things are going to live. And then I think probably the other ones, probably around, how you manage your teams and potentially the flexibility that you can offer staff. But at the same time, there's probably a little bit of commercial gain to be made through that as well. So I think there's going to be some deep thought on that stuff. But I think, when you think about the markets and companies, access to capital and equity capital in particular, or diversified debt capital, in times of uncertainty, I think it's going to be it's going to be top of mind, for a lot of boards and a lot of CEOs and CFOs.
Yeah, so that's going to change the behaviour of some of the companies. And I'm on several boards who are talking about access to capital right now. Another question for you here. What are your thoughts about the shift in MMT from a fringe theory to something governments are seriously contemplating? And what impact do you think that will have on business confidence?
MMT? Sorry?
I asked the same question. I believe it's Diane Edwards' question, and I believe it means modern monetary theory.
Oh, okay. Oh, gosh. I'll have to...
Have I stumped you with a question? Diane knows more about this than either you or I, it turns out.
Yeah, economics degree time. I might not necessarily answer the question directly, but I spent a bit of time in banking before I joined the exchange, and what's going to be interesting here is just how effective monetary policy levers are actually going to be. Sort of at the moment, I know they can, take interest rates into negative territory, but at a very practical level. Banks need to fund themselves, and they fund themselves through deposits. And there is going to be a certain point at which the price of a deposit needs to be in order to attract those deposits. And you wonder whether there's going to be a switch, from, sort of more traditional thinking, which is deposit rates are set off lending rates, to a time where lending rates are set off deposit rates. And that'll flip things around a little bit, which actually means that, some of the monetary policy levers will be a little less effective, especially when we're down at these sorts of interest rate levels. So, maybe coming back to the question, it could be an interesting time to, test whether, the theory is still sound at these levels. But I think, it seems that, our central bankers and the governors and the banks are getting their heads around this anyway. and the role of fiscal policy to stimulate the economy, has got to be the one where we actually lean on. It's got to be supported through monetary policy, but I think the fiscal side of the economic sort of world is the one that's going to drag us out of here.
Good to know something's going to drag us out of here. Thank you for that, Matt. Now, if you can, I've got a lot of questions around the GFC that we suffered in 2008 and 2020 and comparisons. What are the differences and what looks and feels the same?
Yeah, interesting actually. We've done a little bit of work ourselves just on, crises and the differences here. First of all, GFC was largely localized initially in the sense that it was a liquidity issue which revolved into a credit issue, but it was largely financial. It was the financial sector which was the most affected, and obviously it had a spillover effect from there. But this is so widespread and so unknown. The fall was sharper, the fall was deeper, and I suspect the GFC, there was probably a gradual drag out, that might have taken 18 months, 2 years. Whereas this one is just more unknown. So, nobody's quite sure whether, the effectiveness of getting on top of the health issue is, what we've been very effective so far, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. But will it come back, it seems like a virus, as I think Ashley mentioned. It's pretty stubborn. It holds no prisoners. It could come back. So I think that's going to mean we're going to have to be very, very conscious of it for a long time. Vaccine will be interesting as to whether they can get that up and sort of deal with the health issue that way. But I think the uncertainty here and the hard one to compare it to the GFC is just how long it's going to take to come out. But in the meantime, the amount of support that central governments have been applying to economies globally is just at levels that we've never seen before. One or two banks that might need to have been bailed out in economies outside Australasia, that's just tiny, compared to the money that's been pumped in to support economies at the moment. So I think we're in times it's an obvious point, but it's just so new and so big. That it's really, really hard to predict exactly how it's going to unfold.
It is, and uncertainty creates a lot of stress with it, and this is about the most uncertainty we've ever seen. Mark, back to your crystal ball. I've got a question about what you wish for from the budget this afternoon. So if you get this right, we'll be very impressed. Yeah,
well, certainly I think, I'm back to my theme on the role of equity in supporting businesses. And, obviously we want the government to support the economy through this. I think there's going to be some realizations where it needs to be a little bit more targeted than maybe what, the response to date has been. I'm not saying the response to date is wrong at all. I think, the government stepped into a world which was just as unknown to them as everybody else. And I think they wanted to do the right things. And I think generally everybody has done the right things. Now there's probably a chance to refine a little bit more and get some of the targeted areas. But we need to see, some, let's call it leadership out of the government with respect to, getting some projects up and running, focusing on focusing on those projects on things that are going to have an enduring benefit for New Zealand. We know we've got a productivity issue. What are the things that are going to help productivity? We know we've got infrastructure issues. Let's get some of those things up and running. Let's make sure that the investment that we're levering the government's balance sheet on is actually going to deliver returns for us for a long time. Those are the things that are on my mind. At the same time, too, you want the social support that needs to be there to support the people across New Zealand. Health and education, I think, are critically important. But I think the one thing that you hope for is that we don't throw the money into areas that don't necessarily give us a long-term benefit as well. If we can get both of those, stimulate through fiscal activity and deliver a long-term benefit, which transforms us a wee bit, then I think that would be a great outcome.
Now let's hope that Mr. Robertson does exactly that for us this afternoon at 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
Mark, you wouldn't be on the New Zealand Stock Exchange board and on an open forum with people if they didn't ask you some questions about who they should be backing. So the next question is purely crystal ball, and you can all the disclaimers you want. Who are the fastest movers in the capital markets right now, and who are the savviest investors? So who should we be watching to copy?
Well, it's a very tough question. It's very hard to be specific there, actually. I mean, New Zealand has been a pretty innovative country for a long time, and it's very hard to single out areas. But the agricultural sector, I think, is something that we're going to lean on, and I think they're going to deliver. I think our technology sector is going to grow, and I think we've been constantly surprised about how innovative New Zealand is in that area already. But I think that's just going to continue. In terms of the investors, I can't answer that one in terms of who do you follow, who do you back, and that would be wrong of me to do that. But I think even areas where we want to develop some infrastructure. I think we've got some really good capability there too. But hard to know. I think, and even the areas like travel and tourism and all the rest of it, we're pretty good at reinventing as well. So I wouldn't look beyond those businesses either. It might not necessarily have the quantum of overseas travelers that we might have had, but if we can create an Aussie Kiwi bubble, then I think we're going to get really, really interesting innovation out of that. I just trust the capability and the leadership that is in our economy to think that by and large we're going to do some pretty cool stuff, and we might surprise ourselves just what emerges.
Hey, thank you for not saying I'm just not answering that question, but for giving us an answer where you could. I appreciate that. Couple of questions from somebody who's an Australian, which is interesting. Says, you talked about the Kiwi approach of being understated. How do you think this disadvantages us when we go offshore to offshore markets and undersell ourselves? On
one hand, it's a good thing. On another hand, if you're in a competing type situation and you've got to sell yourself strongly, sometimes it is a bit of a disadvantage. But I think people are learning how to deal with that. And at the end of the day too, Kiwis, when they need to, they can put themselves out there as well and sell themselves just as well as anybody else. Whilst I say that, I sort of say it in jest at the same time.
It's interesting. San Francisco says New Zealanders have been much better at blowing their trumpets in the last 2 years than they were in the 2 years preceding that. So I think probably when it's required, we're able to do that. Yeah. I'd like to come back to you. We'll be closing up in about 7 minutes, Mark. So I'd like to come back to you. You've been in lockdown, and it's been a very stressful situation with uncertainty at an all-time high. What have you learned about yourself?
What's been really interesting here is making sure you're ahead of issues. And I said before, you wouldn't want to be buying laptops 2 days before lockdown. I think it's making sure that we've got people, and me, I guess in particular, for the organisation, just looking ahead and making sure that we've thought through or understand the implications of things that might strike us. So for example, when we're in level 4, we thought, how would we operate if it was a level 4 plus? If we didn't really get on top of the health issue and it got even more strict, what would we do? So we'd actually planned for that. We planned for a number of different scenarios. I don't want to leave the team scrambling. That's probably one of the things that I spend my time thinking about. And I guess, you come back to the question, what have you learned about yourself? That aspect, which I guess is a sort of a very sort of, it's an aspect of being very practical, which is probably something that, I might think that I'm reasonably good at.
You might blow your trumpet. We wouldn't want that, would we?
No, we wouldn't want that. And I think the other thing too that I've noticed is there's been a real appreciation in terms of a step up in the communications and again, everybody knows that communications is important, but I guess for me to see and evidence the difference across the organization from action that has actually happened has really cemented that in my mind, and it's just made it absolutely a number one priority, for me each week. to do that sort of stuff, and we'll carry that on. So communications is one, being practical is another, and being, thinking ahead. And I guess in some respects too, all of the things that you want in a leader, which is, being fair to people, being reasonable to people, being authentic to people, calling it as it is, but with some empathy. I think that's gone down quite well as well, certainly across our organisation.
I think that also is a familiar theme that we've seen from a lot of other leaders, is that the skills that you need to draw on turn out to be communication first, second and third, and then fairness, reasonableness, empathy and authenticity. So huge prizes on that one, but good to hear that you not only have those things, you're prepared to admit that you have them, Mark, because that's somewhere we go. So in terms of silver linings, this is going to be a really major thundercloud for New Zealand, and we know that. And we know that a lot of businesses are going to struggle. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. It's going to be particularly hard out there. And it's never been a more important time to look for green shoots of hope than when you are facing this massive thundercloud. Yeah. So silver linings from COVID-19, what can you give us?
Yeah, well, I'll probably go back to that theme of I think people are going to see the need for being able to access capital more often. So for our business and for the market more generally, I think that boards and senior leaders in organisations, I think they're going to value that. And so for the public markets, and we'll do a lot to try and encourage this as well, is to hopefully have a sort of a sentiment change, around, public markets and the benefits that it offers. So I think that could be a silver lining. I think we're going to see, or continue to see, more interest in the markets. From an investor point of view, we've seen, unprecedented levels of activity there. I think, that's going to carry on. I mean, it might settle down, in terms of the levels of activity, but I think, people are going to watch and be interested in. I think you also see the fact that investors for good companies with good futures and well led, I think they're going to see the silver lining there will be that they will be backed by investors. They will be supported and they'll be trusted. I think it comes back to those fundamentals of what's the plan look like and can we trust the team to deliver it. But to the extent that those boxes can be ticked, I think, investors will believe and therefore support. So, those areas of silver linings I see, around the markets and its perception, the product that is public markets and what it provides, companies in terms of access to equity or debt capital, and the opportunities for investors. I think it's going to be around that. I think we're going to see a bit of a sentiment change.
Mark, thank you. And we're going to close up there and I'll hand back to Cerise DeVoe very shortly. But I want to thank you for two things. One is being very, very easy to interview. And two is for showing us an example of your clear communication style and your openness, your honesty, your transparency and your authenticity. So thank you very much and over to you.
Thank you so much for your excellent moderation. And Mark, thank you for being with us today. My name is Cerise DeVoe and I'm Director of Profile and Relationships at the Trans-Tasman Business Circle. You should see now our business sentiment poll pop up on your screen. Please kindly take a few moments to fill this one in and we will then share the results. In the meantime, Mark, thank you for sharing your insights with us today on the topic of resilient leadership. A challenge that probably resonates with the audience is the importance to change the way we communicate. It is also very interesting to hear your next steps and how you have stayed focused on connectivity, customers, and your teams. You were prepared and managing the crisis did not disrupt business continuity. You adapted quickly with critical and non-critical teams, and this shows great leadership. Some of the thoughts that I found very inspiring were the importance of access to capital for businesses during a crisis, tech and agriculture being areas of growth, New Zealand businesses' connection to Singapore, which is very relevant as a circle is also in that market, people's resilience in doing business, and the use of technology to substitute travel when business relationships are already strong. Your thoughts for the future are very optimistic, and we are excited for a great outcome. We hope that you are enjoying the Circle's first event series focusing on resilient leadership in challenging times, generously supported by CBA, IBM, Red Hat, and ServiceNow. As Sharon mentioned, we are very grateful of your valuable support. If you have missed any of our past events, they are available on Trans-Tasman Business Circle channel on YouTube. Now, the results of the business sentiment poll, let me find them back up. I've lost them, here we go. So 64% of you are feeling innovative. 73% believe that the government is doing a great job in this crisis. 64% of you think that your estimate time will be 12 months, and 100% have met objectives. So that's really good, thank you. So to all our viewers, thank you for listening in today. And Mark, thank you again for being with us. I will now hand over to you for the final words.
Oh, certainly. You know, thank you very much for the opportunity. You know, great to talk to people. You know, final words for me, it's probably just a repeating theme of you know, for listeners, is this ability to access capital in the time of uncertainty. And, you know, I think if people can think more about that and open up those channels, you know, through the use of, you know, public markets, you know, for equity or debt capital, I think that's going to stand us in a really good stead for, you know, facilitating the innovation and having opportunities for investors to back good, you know, good, strong people. So, you know, thanks again for, you're from the Trans-Tasman Business Circle. It's been a pleasure. We'll do it again sometime.